of us, both here in this room and everyone watching on television, has been horrified by the incidents that occurred in Newtown, in Tucson, and elsewhere. And I don't think there is one of us that wouldn't like us to find a way as a society to put an end to events like this. It would be my preference if we could find a way to put an end to events like this without doing violence to the Constitution and also without leaving law-abiding citizens more vulnerable to crime. There are a number of statistics on this, but one statistic I've read has indicated that about 2.5 million times a year in America, a gun is used to protect its owner, its possessor, from a crime. That's quite significant, and that's a fact that we need to take into account. There's been a lot of reference today to the fact that the protections of the Constitution, the protections of the Second Amendment right to bear arms, are not unlimited. And I agree that they are not unlimited. There are limits. I think it's important for us from time to time to focus on what those limits are. The Supreme Court in District of Columbia versus Heller held that the guns that are within the zone of protection of the Second Amendment are those that are typically possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes. Why don't we start with you, Professor Koppel? Can you tell me, is a gun, a semi-automatic weapon, whether a rifle or a handgun, that holds more than 10 rounds in its ammunition magazine, one that could fairly be characterized as one that's typically possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes?
In handguns, semi-automatics are 81% of new handguns sold. A very large percentage of those have as standard, not as high capacity, but as standard factory magazines between 11 and 19 rounds. Another thing that is very common, to get back to Senator Whitehouse's issue about the Remington 870 shotgun, is Senator Feinstein's bill would outlaw that shotgun if it has a 7-round magazine on it. It comes with a 5-round magazine. You can extend it by 2 rounds, and the Feinstein bill would outlaw that very standard home defense shotgun if it simply has a 7-round magazine. So it's all fine to talk about novelty items on the fringe, like a 100-round drum, but in practice, what is at threat of being outlawed that people are actually using is their standard capacity handgun magazines and standard capacity magazines for rifles and shotguns.
And what are the law-abiding citizens doing with these? In other words, what are the lawful purposes to which law-abiding citizens are putting these guns, who own them?
Self-defense, target shooting, all the purposes which is lawful to possess a firearm. And I would, regarding what the Chief was talking about all this extra training that police officers have, well, since I've represented the 2 leading police training organizations in the U.S. Supreme Court, I would certainly agree that the police have more training for all kinds of reasons, including they have the power to effectuate arrests, which ordinary citizens don't. But the training, in the view of the police training organizations, the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors, they believe that the training that is required in most states to obtain a permit to carry a handgun for lawful protection of self, only 9 states currently violate that by not letting trained citizens carry, that is appropriate, sufficient for people to be able to protect themselves, not necessarily to go out and do arrests, but to defend themselves, and that includes defending themselves in their place of employment, including if that place of employment happens to be a school.
Now, one of the arguments that I've frequently heard for making this type of weapon illegal, or making any weapon illegal if you're using an ammunition magazine containing more than 10 rounds, is that weapons like these are available on a widespread basis, that it's relatively easy to buy them, in the sense that, you know, most people may lawfully buy them and own them.
Yeah.
And that's used as an argument in favor of restricting access to these weapons. In your opinion, does that make it more or less constitutionally permissible to restrict their sale?
Well, I think you've hit exactly what District of Columbia versus Heller was all about, which is, you know, you talk about how often are 100-round drum magazines used in crimes. pretty rarely. How often are they used in self-defense? Pretty rarely, too. Handguns are used. There's 70% of gun homicides in this country are perpetrated with handguns. And the Supreme Court said the fact that these are very frequently used in crimes does not mean that under the Constitution you can prohibit them. So the fact that you can point to any particular crime where a gun was misused and say, oh, that proves we have to ban this gun or this accessory, is the opposite of what the Supreme Court is saying. The Supreme Court is saying you don't look only at the misuse of an arm or an accessory. You look at its lawful use. Does it have common lawful use? Yes, handguns have common lawful use. Yes, handgun magazines and the standard size of 11 to 19 rounds have common lawful use. And yes, the AR-15 rifle, the most popular best-selling rifle in this country for years, has pervasive lawful use.
So if we restrict access to these guns, we're limiting the ability of individual Americans, law-abiding Americans, to use them for lawful purposes.
Yes, and the teaching of Heller is the fact that criminals may misuse something does not in itself constitute sufficient reason to prohibit law-abiding citizens from using a commonly used firearm.
Ms. Trotter, do most of the gun-owning women that you know have an inclination to abide by the law in connection with their gun ownership?
Yes, definitely.
If we were to ban all weapons that contained an ammunition magazine capable of accommodating more than 10 rounds, would most female gun owners that you know abide by that law?
Of course.
What about criminals? What about people who use weapons like these in connection with crimes? Do you think they are as likely to abide by that law?
By definition, criminals are not abiding by the law.
Where does that then put women like those that you describe, women like those that you represent? What kind of position does this put them in relative to their current position as to their ability to defend themselves?
It disarms the women. It puts them at a severe disadvantage, and it not only affects them, but it affects anybody that they're responsible for, their children, elderly relatives, incapacitated family members.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired. I've got one question for Mr. Johnson, if I could have. Mr. Johnson, according to FBI statistics, about 72% of the gun homicides that are committed each year in America are committed with handguns. 4% with rifles, 4% with shotguns, 1% with other types of firearms, and then 18% that fit into the category of unknown. But 72% classified as handguns. If 72% of the gun homicides are being committed with handguns, would that suggest that you would prefer banning handguns as well?
Our partnership, and frankly, I've been party to no discussion of banning handguns or restricting handguns from women or any other group. I don't want to give up my handguns. We're here today to talk about a universal background check that would help make our nation safer and limiting high-capacity magazines. They're used in crimes of violence across America.
Even though far more people die each year from handgun-inflicted injuries than from assault rifle-inflicted injuries.
We believe the limit on high-capacity magazines, even for handguns, is necessary. No more than 10.
Senator Klobuchar.